The worst kind of trouble is the one you never see coming. Karoline Leavitt had taken flights more times than she could count. It was second nature. Book the ticket, pack the bag, get through security, board the plane. Simple. Until the day it wasn't. She arrived at the airport like any other traveler, moving through the crowd, dragging her carry-on behind her. The usual airport chaos surrounded her. Families rushing with strollers, business travelers glued to their phones, flight announcements echoing overhead. It felt like just another day. But then, something felt off. A momentary pause. A pair of watchful eyes. A hushed conversation that seemed to stop the second she walked past. She ignored it at first. She had learned to tune out whispers, to pretend not to notice when people recognized her. It came with the territory. Some admired her, others despised her. That was politics. Yet, as she approached her gate, the feeling grew stronger. A flight attendant stood near the boarding area, her eyes scanning the passengers. Searching. Waiting. Then, their gazes met. And for a split second, the woman's face hardened. Karoline barely had time to process it before stepping forward, handing over her boarding pass with a polite nod. The attendant glanced at it, then at her. A brief hesitation. A forced smile. "I just need to check something," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The line continued moving. No delays. No extra screening. Just her. Karoline stood at the gate, her boarding pass still in hand. The flight attendant had walked away without a word, leaving her standing there, unsure of what just happened. She glanced around. The other passengers handed over their passes, got a quick nod, and moved forward without issue. Something wasn't right. She shifted her bag and stepped aside, not wanting to block the line. The man behind her, dressed casually with a baseball cap, glanced at her before moving past without hesitation. A woman with a stroller received a warm smile from another attendant as she was helped through. No extra checks. No delays. Just her. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Years in politics had taught her how to mask discomfort, how to stand firm even when the ground beneath her felt uncertain. The flight attendant, a woman in her early 30s with a sharp ponytail, stood at the desk, speaking in hushed tones with a coworker. Every so often, she glanced back at Karoline. The younger employee beside her looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, nodding but not speaking. Karoline exhaled slowly, trying to piece together what was happening. This wasn't normal. If there was a security issue, TSA would have been involved. If it was a random check, why wasn't anyone else being stopped? She took a step closer. The conversation at the desk went quiet. The flight attendant turned, her polite smile thin and forced. "Ms. Leavitt, we just need to verify some information before you can board," she said, voice smooth but lacking warmth. Karoline kept her posture relaxed. What kind of information? The woman hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "It's standard procedure," she finally said. Karoline held her gaze. Standard for who? No answer. Behind her, the line of passengers waiting to board was moving steadily. Some had noticed the exchange. A few turned their heads, curiosity creeping into their expressions. A teenage boy nudged his mother. A businessman in a dark suit raised an eyebrow but kept scrolling on his phone. A woman further back held up her device in a way that suggested she was recording. The weight of their attention pressed in. Karoline's pulse remained steady, but she knew exactly what was happening. She had boarded countless flights. She knew how this worked. And this? This wasn't normal. The young employee shifted uncomfortably, looking between Karoline and the flight attendant as if silently questioning how far this was going to go. "Is there an issue with my reservation?" Karoline asked, keeping her voice even. "No, of course not," the attendant replied quickly. "We just need to confirm a few things before we can clear you for boarding." "Like what?" Another pause. Karoline knew that look. It was the look of someone scrambling to find a reason, someone trying to justify something they hadn't thought through. She glanced back at the passengers. Some were pretending not to listen, others had abandoned subtlety entirely. The man with the baseball cap had stopped at the boarding lane, watching the exchange unfold. "Everything all right up there?" he asked, directing the question at no one in particular. The flight attendant straightened. "There's no problem. We're just following protocol." That word again. Protocol. A word vague enough to mean anything and nothing at the same time. Karoline inhaled deeply. She could let this play out quietly, step aside, wait for whatever game they were playing to be over. Or she could push back. She made her decision. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor." The air around them shifted. The flight attendant's grip tightened around the tablet in her hands. A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance? Doubt? Before she forced another thin smile. "There's no need for that," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I'm simply following airline policy." "Then your supervisor won't mind explaining that policy to me." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. The younger employee glanced at the gate desk, then at the other passengers. She swallowed hard. "Melissa," she started to say, but the flight attendant, Melissa, cut her off with a quick shake of her head. "I've got it handled," she snapped. But she didn't. And everyone could see it. Karoline didn't move. The words had already left her mouth. Clear, firm, non-negotiable. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor." Melissa's smile stiffened, her fingers tightening around the tablet she held. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. "There's no need for that," she repeated, but the confidence behind her voice wavered. Karoline didn't blink. "Then there shouldn't be a problem calling one." A ripple of quiet shifted through the waiting area. The passengers standing nearby weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. Some tried to act indifferent, looking at their phones or pretending to be occupied with their own boarding process. But others weren't even hiding their curiosity now. Melissa turned slightly, lowering her voice. "Ms. Leavitt, I need you to step aside while we—" "I'm fine right here," Karoline cut in. A pause. The younger flight attendant, still lingering near the desk, swallowed hard. She glanced between Melissa and Karoline, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Melissa exhaled sharply through her nose. "Ms. Leavitt, if you refuse to cooperate, we may have to reconsider allowing you on this flight." A few gasps from the crowd. Karoline's brow lifted. Reconsider. The way she said it made Melissa falter for just a second. A man a few feet away, baseball cap, carry-on slung over his shoulder, cleared his throat. "Is there a reason she's being stopped? Because it kinda looks like you're making this up as you go." Melissa's head snapped in his direction. "Sir, this does not concern you." "Yeah, well, I think it does," the man said, folding his arms. "I paid for my ticket just like she did. If someone can get blocked for no reason, I'd kinda like to know why." That did it. A murmur spread through the crowd. Karoline could feel the shift. First quiet curiosity, now growing frustration. She knew this moment well. Melissa must have felt it too because she straightened her shoulders, trying to regain control. "I am following airline policy," she insisted. "Which policy?" Karoline asked. Melissa hesitated. The woman in the blazer, still holding her phone at an angle that suggested she was recording, let out a small, knowing laugh. "I just need to verify some details before you board." Melissa pressed on, voice colder now. "Then verify them." Karoline gestured to the desk. "Call whoever you need. I'll wait." Melissa's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected this. She had likely assumed Karoline would back down, step aside, let this play out quietly. But that wasn't happening. Instead of responding, Melissa turned sharply on her heel and marched toward the podium near the jet bridge. She picked up the radio, muttering something into it. Karoline stayed still, watching. The tension in the air thickened. The man with the baseball cap shook his head. "This is ridiculous." The woman in the blazer whispered something to the person next to her, both of them now openly filming. A flight attendant inside the plane stepped forward slightly, peeking out at the scene unfolding. After what felt like an eternity, Melissa turned back, lowering the radio. "A supervisor is on the way," she announced, her voice clipped, her expression unreadable. That didn't have the effect she wanted. Instead of diffusing the situation, it made it worse. Passengers shifted in their spots, eyes narrowing. The energy in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer just about Karoline. It was about the principle of it all. A man in a business suit spoke up. If she's being stopped, there should be a legitimate reason. If there isn't, she should be allowed to board like the rest of us. Melissa ignored him. Karoline inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She had been in worse situations than this, but she also knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about policy. This wasn't about security. This was about something else entirely. She met Melissa's gaze again, watching carefully. There was something beneath the forced professionalism, something more personal. Melissa knew exactly what she was doing. She just didn't expect to be challenged. The minutes stretched on. The quiet hum of the airport continued around them, but the gate felt like it existed in its own bubble now. Every second that passed only made Melissa's stance weaker. Then, finally, footsteps. A man in a navy blue airline blazer approached, his ID clipped to his chest. Late 40s, graying at the temples. The look of someone who had dealt with airport disputes far too many times. What's going on here? The crowd hushed slightly, waiting. Melissa turned, relief flashing across her face. Oh, good, you're here. She quickly adjusted her stance. Ms. Leavitt's boarding requires additional verification before we can proceed. The supervisor's eyes flicked to Karoline, then back to Melissa. Verification for what? Melissa opened her mouth, paused, and in that hesitation, the truth spilled out. She didn't have an answer. The supervisor's frown deepened. Has TSA spoken with her? Karoline didn't wait. No, they haven't. Because this isn't about security. The supervisor turned back to Melissa, his patience visibly thinning. Is that true? Melissa's lips pressed together. We're just being cautious. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. One moment. He gestured for Melissa to step aside, lowering his voice as he spoke to her. Karoline didn't need to hear the words. The body language said it all. Melissa was on shaky ground. And she knew it. The supervisor's eyes remained on Melissa, waiting for an explanation. The seconds dragged, the silence thick. She had nowhere to go. We're just being cautious, Melissa repeated, but the words lacked confidence now. The supervisor's jaw tightened. Cautious about what? Melissa hesitated. It's just protocol. That was the breaking point. Karoline crossed her arms. What protocol, exactly? The supervisor glanced at her, then back at Melissa. Well, passengers leaned in, the air charged with expectation. Melissa shifted her weight. She could be she stopped, catching herself. The supervisor lifted a brow. What? Melissa blinked, realizing she had no way out. The man in the baseball cap let out a low whistle. Wow, this is actually happening. The crowd murmured in agreement. The tension snapped like a rope pulled too tight. The situation had changed. This wasn't just about one woman boarding a plane anymore. This was about everyone watching. A woman with sunglasses and a carry-on bag folded her arms. If she has a ticket and isn't on a no-fly list, why can't she board? A teenage boy next to her muttered, she's being singled out. Melissa noticed. She stiffened, looking around, realizing just how many people were watching. Phones were up now, capturing every second. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to the supervisor. Sir, I believe Ms. Leavitt is causing a disruption. The way she said it, the deliberate tone, made Karoline's stomach turn. A disruption. Karoline repeated, voice steady. Melissa squared her shoulders. Yes. Karoline let the word settle. Then, calmly, she asked, am I disrupting this flight, or do you just not want me on it? A sharp inhale from someone nearby. Melissa's face burned red. That's not what this is about. The supervisor ran a hand over his face, clearly frustrated. All right, enough of this. He turned to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, you're free to board. A beat of silence. Then, scattered claps. Melissa's eyes widened. Wait, what? The supervisor ignored her. He gestured toward the jet bridge. Go ahead. But before Karoline could step forward, Melissa did something no one expected. She moved in front of the boarding lane, physically blocking it. Gasps rippled through the waiting area. Someone muttered, "Oh, she's lost it." A woman in a business suit sighed, shaking her head. The supervisor's patience finally snapped. Melissa. Melissa stood firm. I have the right to deny boarding if I feel it's necessary. The crowd's energy shifted again, disbelief washing over them. The man with the baseball cap scoffed. Are you serious right now? The woman with sunglasses shook her head. This is insane. Karoline stayed still. Melissa's hands clenched. She's a risk. A flicker of something in her eyes. Desperation. Anger. Maybe both. Karoline didn't let it go. A risk to what, exactly? Melissa's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The supervisor exhaled sharply. That's enough. Step aside. Melissa didn't move. The supervisor turned to another airline employee at the desk. Escort her to the office. Now. Melissa's breath hitched. Wait. The younger flight attendant, who had been silent this whole time, stepped forward hesitantly. Melissa, just let it go. But Melissa wasn't listening. Her entire body was tense, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. You're just going to let her board? She demanded. The supervisor's voice was firm. You're done here. Silence. Then, slowly, Melissa stepped back. The realization hit her. She had lost. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came out. The younger flight attendant finally moved, gently taking her arm. Come on. Melissa let herself be led away, her face a mask of shock. The crowd watched as she disappeared from sight. The woman in the blazer lowered her phone. Well, that escalated. The supervisor took a deep breath, adjusting his stance before turning back to Karoline. You're cleared to board, he repeated, this time softer. Karoline met his gaze. I'd like to file a complaint. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then, he nodded. Understood. Someone in the back let out a low chuckle. The woman with sunglasses gave a small, approving nod. Karoline picked up her carry-on, adjusted the strap, and without another word, stepped onto the jet bridge. The flight was waiting. And this? This wasn't over. The airport buzzed with murmurs, but at the gate, all eyes were locked on one person, Melissa. The supervisor, still standing between her and Karoline, rubbed his temple, clearly losing patience. I'll ask again, he said, his voice even. Has TSA flagged Ms. Leavitt for security concerns? Melissa hesitated. The answer was obvious, but she didn't want to say it. Karoline stayed quiet, watching her carefully. The pause stretched a little too long. No, Melissa finally muttered, barely audible. The supervisor's frown deepened. Then what exactly are we verifying? Melissa opened her mouth, closed it, then glanced at the younger flight attendant. The woman shifted uncomfortably, looking away as if she wanted no part in this. A passenger, the man in the baseball cap, let out a short laugh. She's stalling. We all see it. That was when everything shifted. The unspoken thoughts became spoken ones. A woman near the front shook her head. You don't need clearance from TSA, but she still can't board? Why? Another voice chimed in. If there's no real reason, just let her on. People weren't just watching anymore. They were questioning. Melissa straightened, trying to hold her ground. We reserve the right to deny service to anyone. Karoline exhaled slowly. There it was. She didn't say safety. She didn't mention security. She just admitted that it was a choice. A choice. One the crowd clearly didn't agree with. Karoline turned to the supervisor. So, is this a safety issue, Or is this personal? The words sliced through the air. Melissa's fingers curled into fists. That's not what this is about. Then explain what it is about, Karoline said evenly. Melissa hesitated again. The silence spoke louder than any answer she could have given. Passengers shifted. A woman in a blazer, still recording, narrowed her eyes. I think we already know what this is about. Melissa's face turned red. She had lost control, and everyone could see it. The supervisor exhaled sharply, looking exhausted. Ms. Leavitt, you're free to board. Scattered applause broke out. A man near the back muttered, took long enough. Karoline didn't move yet. She let the moment sit, let Melissa feel the weight of her mistake. Melissa, flustered, turned to the supervisor. This is a mistake. He shot her a look. You're right. It is. Yours. Her breath hitched. You were just making a situation where there wasn't one, he interrupted, his patience completely gone. You don't have the authority to block someone without cause. Melissa swallowed hard, but the damage was done. She had tried to push Karoline out, but now, she was the one being pushed aside. Karoline finally adjusted her bag and stepped toward the gate. The younger flight attendant quickly scanned her boarding pass without a word. Melissa watched, shoulders stiff, lips pressed tightly together. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't say another word to her. She didn't need to. She stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving Melissa behind. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Karoline had already stepped onto the jet bridge when she heard it. No! The word rang out, sharp and desperate. She turned back. Melissa stood frozen at the gate, her breathing uneven. Her hands, once steady, now trembled at her sides. The professional mask she had worn so tightly had cracked. You can't just let her board, she blurted, her voice rising. The crowd tensed. A few people exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Others watched in stunned silence. The supervisor had clearly had enough. His tone was firm, final. Melissa, step away from the gate. Melissa didn't move. The younger flight attendant, standing a few feet behind, shifted uncomfortably. She looked as if she wanted to disappear. She's a disruption, Melissa repeated, though now it sounded less like a statement and more like an excuse. The supervisor's patience snapped. The only disruption here is you. The words hit like a hammer. A murmur spread through the passengers. Phones stayed up, cameras rolling. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something bigger. Melissa's chest rose and fell quickly. She glanced around, realizing the support she had expected wasn't there. No one was backing her. No one was defending her. She had miscalculated. She took a step back, then forward again, as if caught between fight and retreat. I was following protocol, she insisted, but the words sounded weak now. Karoline adjusted the strap of her carry-on. Her voice remained steady. I want to file a formal complaint. Melissa flinched. The shift was complete. The control she had fought to keep had slipped away entirely. The supervisor nodded. That will be handled. Then, looking at Melissa, his tone turned cold. We'll also be reviewing your actions today. Melissa's face paled. You're blaming me for this. The supervisor didn't blink. You did this to yourself. A beat of silence. Melissa swallowed hard, as if trying to process what had just happened. But the moment had passed. The decision had been made. She had lost. And she knew it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't look back. The younger flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then quickly moved to take her place at the gate. The tension finally broke. The supervisor turned to Karoline, his tone softer now. You're free to board. She nodded once. Then, without a glance at the fading figure of Melissa, she stepped onto the plane. Behind her, the whispers continued. But Melissa's voice was no longer among them. Karoline settled into her seat, fastening the belt with steady hands. The hum of the cabin surrounded her, but her mind stayed on the gate. The confrontation was over, but the weight of it still lingered. Passengers walked past, some sneaking glances her way. A few gave subtle nods, silent acknowledgements of what had just happened. Others whispered among themselves, their voices low but their expressions clear. People had seen, and people cared. Then, movement at the front of the plane. A man in a navy blazer stepped on board, flanked by 2 other airline officials. His ID badge read Daniel Reese, Regional Supervisor. He scanned the rows before stopping at Karoline's seat. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his tone measured. "May I have a moment?" Karoline remained seated. "Right here is fine." A flicker of hesitation. He had expected her to follow him off the plane, to handle this quietly. But she wasn't playing along. He adjusted his stance. "I was just briefed on the situation at the gate," he began. "On behalf of the airline, I'd like to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced." Karoline tilted her head. "Inconvenience?" A murmur rippled through nearby passengers. Reese exhaled lightly, shifting his weight. "The employee in question has been removed from duty pending review. This is not how we operate." Karoline studied him. The words were polished, carefully chosen. A corporate script meant to acknowledge the issue without fully admitting fault. She leaned back, arms crossed. "Will she be fired?" Reese's lips pressed together. He had prepared for this. "Internal reviews are confidential," he said smoothly. "But I can assure you, we take this very seriously." Karoline let the silence stretch. Reese cleared his throat. "If there's anything you need during your flight, please don't hesitate to ask." A few rows behind, someone whispered, "Translation. Nothing's going to happen." Reese heard it. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Karoline gave him a small nod. "I'll be watching." His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes shifted. He understood what that meant. This wasn't going away. He turned and left the plane, the other officials following. As the door closed behind them, passengers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Others looked as if they had just witnessed something bigger than an airport dispute. Karoline faced forward. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The plane touched down at Nashville International Airport, but before Karoline even grabbed her bag, her phone vibrated nonstop. She pulled it out. Dozens of notifications. News alerts. Missed calls. Texts from people she hadn't spoken to in months. She tapped on one of the links. A video was trending. It was grainy, filmed on a phone, but it captured everything. The tense exchange at the gate, the way Melissa blocked the entrance, the moment the supervisor overruled her. And then, Melissa's face when she realized she had lost. 2.1 million views. The caption underneath was blunt. "Flight attendant denies boarding to Karoline Leavitt, gets put in her place." Karoline scrolled further. The hashtags were already flooding social media. Small blue diamond #fire Melissa. Small blue diamond #bias in the sky. Small blue diamond #accountability matters. Thousands of people were weighing in. Some called for Melissa's termination. Others demanded an investigation into airline policies. She switched to Twitter. The airline's official account had released a statement. "We are aware of the incident at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full review. We do not condone discrimination of any kind." The comments were brutal. "Small blue diamond, you don't condone it? It happened at your gate, on your watch. Small blue diamond, she was caught on camera. Don't review it. Fire her. Small blue diamond, what happens to the passengers this happens to off camera?" Karoline kept scrolling. Legal experts were already speaking up. Some suggested that she had grounds for legal action. Others pointed out that this wasn't just about one person. It was about systemic bias. And just when it seemed like the backlash couldn't get worse for the airline, it did. A second video surfaced. This one was filmed from a different angle, closer, clearer. And it caught something the first one didn't. Melissa, standing at the gate, arms crossed, muttering under her breath. At first, it was barely audible. But the internet did what the internet does best. Someone enhanced the audio, slowed it down, boosted the clarity. The words became unmistakable. I don't let people like her on my plane. Silence. Then, the internet exploded. The backlash tripled. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was personal. And now, the airline had no choice but to act. By the next morning, reporters were camped outside the airline's corporate office. Others were outside Melissa's home. The airline's PR team scrambled. They couldn't afford to wait. A new statement dropped. After a thorough internal review, the employee involved in the recent incident has been terminated effective immediately. We reaffirm our commitment to fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of political beliefs. The internet reacted instantly. Small Blue Diamond took you long enough. Small Blue Diamond, they fired her. But how many others are still working there? Small Blue Diamond, now do something for the passengers this happens to who don't have millions watching. Karoline set her phone down. Melissa had tried to make her a lesson. But in the end, she was the one who got schooled. Karoline sat in her hotel room, her phone still lighting up with notifications. The news had spread far beyond the airport. The incident wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a conversation. She took a slow breath, letting the weight of it settle. Melissa had tried to send a message. She had tried to make Karoline feel unwelcome, out of place. But in the end, she was the one who had been held accountable. Karoline had the platform, the voice, the audience to fight back. But how many others had been in her position without cameras rolling? How many travelers had been quietly turned away, with no viral video to prove it? A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find an older woman, maybe in her 60s, standing there with a kind smile. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, a tote bag slung over one shoulder. "Ms. Leavitt," she said gently, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Karoline shook her head. "Not at all." The woman hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you." Karoline blinked. "For what?" "For standing up for yourself," the woman said. "For standing up for all of us." Karoline's chest tightened. The woman adjusted her bag. "I fly often, and I've seen things like this happen before. Not always so obvious, but enough to make you feel like you don't belong." She let out a small sigh. "People notice, and we appreciate what you did." For the first time since leaving that airport, Karoline felt a real sense of resolution. This was never just about her. Melissa had tried to silence someone. Instead, she had reminded the world why it's so important to speak up. The woman gave a small nod. "I won't take up any more of your time. Just wanted to say my piece." Karoline smiled. "I'm glad you did." As the door closed, she set her phone aside. The notifications would keep coming. The world would keep talking. But for now, she didn't need to check the headlines. She already knew how this story ended. Not with anger. Not with gloating. But with a simple truth. When you stand your ground, you remind others they can, too.